Okay, as you can see, these are slides from August 6th of last year. Nothing's changed. So if you were in last year's
Yeah.
meeting, or you watched the video recently, which I sent out over the Google group, feel free to go and grab a drink. I'm just going to go over the same content once again. So Varroa Destructor, for those who are unfamiliar, is a parasitic invasive mite. It may not be fair to call Varroa invasive because in some ways Apis mellifera, the bee that it feeds on primarily, is also invasive, although it was introduced by humans. Whereas this was an accident. We did not mean to bring Varroa Destructor to our shores. It just happened to catch a ride on probably some bees from another country and has taken up residence. So Varroa Destructor feeds on the fat body tissue of larvae, pupa, and adult bees. You may have read in a beekeeping book that is out of date that it feeds on the bee's hemolymph, or its blood, bee blood, which is clear. That is not true. We now know, because of some research that Dr. Samuel Ramsey did, he was a speaker at 2 of our meetings last year, that it feeds on the fat body tissue, which can kind of be thought of as the bee's liver, which kind of adds to this idea that, if we were to eat away at your liver, you probably would have a harder time dealing with pesticides that were introduced to your body or other kinds of toxins. So that kind of gives you an idea of how Varroa Destructor is not only damaging to the bees in the short term, but also prevents them from being able to defend against other threats. Varroa reduces colony vigor and transmits and enhances diseases. So not only are they nasty little liver eaters or fat body tissue eaters, they also transmit lots of viruses that are damaging to the bees. The one that you'll probably notice because it has a visual appearance on the bees is deformed wing virus. So if you see bees crawling around that have wings that are kind of shriveled up, that is a sign they have deformed wing virus and likely have a pretty big Varroa population. Colonies with high levels of Varroa may die within months. So we usually see this happen over winter here because it's when the bees are most stressed, but it could happen any time of the year. Varroa is almost everywhere. So there are a few countries left where Varroa is absent. The one that is most salient here is Australia. So Australia has managed to keep Varroa off of their shores, but all of the other continents where we keep bees have Varroa. Where do they come from? They originally evolved in Korea, Japan, and Thailand, and co-evolved with Apis cerana, which is the Asian honeybee. They did not evolve alongside Apis mellifera, which is the European honeybee, the kind of honeybee that we keep. So you can, it's that they didn't co-evolve with the European honeybee, and therefore the European honeybee doesn't have the same defenses that Apis cerana does against the mites. They got a foothold in the United States starting in 1987, and sometime, I believe, in the 90s, they made their way to California. They started on the East Coast, and now they're here to stay. So Varroa's life cycle. Mites reproduce in capped cells. Some treatments will kill Varroa in the cells. Others only kill phoretic Varroa, phoretic mites, that walk around on the surfaces of the bees. So we'll talk about different kinds of treatments tonight, and you can certainly ask questions about different kinds of treatments. Some of them are capable of penetrating the cell caps, and others are not. So formic acid, for example, can penetrate the cell cappings and can actually kill mites inside capped cells. Oxalic acid cannot. So that's why the treatment with oxalic acid usually requires multiple applications, so you can try and get more open cells, more cycles where the acid is penetrating into open cells, since it can't penetrate capped cells, or at least not well enough. Mite loads double monthly. So you may remember from basic biology that populations tend to have an exponential growth rate. That's true of Varroa mites as well. So as a rule, if the colony has brood, mite populations are going to double about once a month. This is a common graph that you're going to see anytime somebody talks about Varroa, showing two things. The blue peak is the bee population peak, and the orange peak is the mite population peak. So what you see here is that there is a slight delay in terms of the mite buildup compared to the bee buildup. And that peak is right about now. So that's why we have the Varroa meeting usually in August, because right now is the right time to be worried about high mite populations and what you're going to do about those going into winter. So you may think that this talk does not apply to you and that your hives do not have Varroa mites. And at any particular moment in time, you might be right. You might have just had a brood break. You might have a colony that is pristine for some reason. However, your bees live outside and they don't keep to their own hives all of the time. There is a natural drift of workers and drones between hives. There is robbing of weak colonies by stronger ones, and they'll carry Varroa on them. There's swarming and absconding, which carries mites around. They also pass mites between each other when foraging. And there's also human-aided exchange of bees and frames between colonies, which aids in the exchange of mites. So your hive will have mites at some point, which is why this is an important topic for anybody that's keeping bees anywhere except for Australia. However, you don't have to worry about mites on unoccupied bee equipment because unoccupied bee equipment does not harbor live mites. They have to have a host. Unoccupied bee equipment can harbor other pests like moths and beetles. So you do have to worry about that, which is why we usually freeze frames before storage. Or there are other ways of handling that, but most, I think, members freeze. Cool. Just a brief introduction to the idea of integrated pest management. This is not a topic or a concept that originated in beekeeping. It's kind of a general agricultural way of thinking about how to manage various types of threats to the whatever you're farming. And that is that you're trying to prevent before intervening. You're trying to work with less toxic interventions before you work with more toxic interventions. So at the bottom is kind of the base of ways that you can prevent Varroa buildup. That includes trying to use resistant stock, although that's hard to verify, and most bee breeders will say that their stock is Varroa resistant. So small cell comb is something else that people do. You can buy, I didn't know this actually until last year, that the standard cell sizes that we use were designed not for the benefit of the bees, but for the benefit of humans in extraction. So you can also buy smaller cell comb to force the bees to create smaller cells for their workers, which is some people believe reduces the mite load on your hive. And also brood breaks. This is when your hive cannot produce brood. This happens when you split, basically anytime they're queenless. So that's another way that some beekeepers will manage Varroa. There are also mechanical means. There are things like using a screen bottom board, doing powdered sugar kind of dustings over your bees. Some people believe will reduce the mite population. However, I don't think that's really been shown to be effective. Other ways are mite trapping. So you may have seen comb with larger cell sizes so large that the queen will always lay drones in those cells. And then some people will take those drone frames out and freeze them. You have to be careful though about timing because you need to freeze the drone cells when the drones are capped. Otherwise, you'll just end up exploding the mite population. This is relevant because the Varroa prefer drones over worker cells, so you'll end up capturing a lot of Varroa in a frame full of drone cells. There are also so-called natural compounds. I don't really like to refer to these as natural. I call them organic acids. Thymol actually, I guess, is not an organic acid. I think it's an oil. But these include formic, oxalic, thymol, hop beta acids, HopGuard, which are all ways of managing Varroa with chemicals. However, these chemicals are natural in some way. They exist in lower concentrations in hives. So some people prefer those. And then there are synthetic compounds. like Apivar or Apistan, and Oliver, who is going to be answering questions tonight, has experience with those. I sent out an email to the Google group saying, if you just search for Varroa on the Google group, one of the most recent emails will be the right one. And that has links to all of the Honeybee Health Coalition resources, which are really useful for just getting a basic understanding of Varroa and how they can be managed, how to test for your mite load, also a tool for determining what type of treatment to use depending upon the situation that your hive's in and the time of year. So we really recommend that you check that out whenever you are considering how to treat for Varroa, or really at any time understanding why and how to treat for Varroa. Okay, that's me. So 12 minutes. Took longer than I thought it would, sorry. So let me introduce our question answers for tonight. Oliver Frank has been keeping bees for a while. I'll have him introduce himself and talk a bit about that. But Oliver has used all types of treatments and can speak to lots of different methods of treating for Varroa. He manages lots and lots of hives. He's a commercial beekeeper, so he's got lots of experience as well. Bob Silverstein, I think, Bob, you usually use organic acids, right? I don't think you're yeah, okay. So Bob kind of is our middle ground guy. He doesn't usually use the synthetics, but does treat for Varroa using oxalic. Do you also use formic? Or
yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. And then finally, Alla does not use any kinds of chemical treatments, organic acids or otherwise. She uses brood breaks and other kind of cultural and mechanical methods for managing the Varroa in her hives. Cool. So why don't we start with Alla? Why don't you just give a 2 to 3 minute introduction about how long you've been keeping bees and your general philosophy on Varroa management.
Hi, everybody. So I'm keeping bees for 10 years. And first year I was treating my bees, and my queen died, and I decided that I would never, ever put any chemicals in a hive. So this is my theory, and I keep it for 9 years successfully. Every year I have maximum 5-8% of losses. I have 70 hives and sell a lot of nooks and queens, and none of them are treated, and none of them, basically I treat only with herb tea. Herb tea I cook from Artemisia, pine fresh, grows, and honey. So this is all only things I put in a hive. So I don't use foundation, I don't use plastic, I don't use wire. So I prefer my hive look like it would be looking on a tree, you know, a natural way. And yeah, my goal is just prove people that you don't need to treat, they can survive and thrive. And I enjoy doing non-treatment beekeeping.
Thank you, Alla. Bob, would you talk a little bit about how long you've been keeping bees and how you manage Varroa?
Yeah, I'm in my 7th year now. I consider myself a backyard beekeeper, although I've been told that I'm a sideliner by older guys. And my very first hive, I did the sticky board on. I had 150 mites per day. I showed that to one of our older beekeepers, and he was shocked. I didn't know anything at that time, and I went ahead and looked at all the literature and all that sort of stuff, and Honeybee Health Coalition, etc. and decided that I would use, at that time, oxalic acid because I didn't have very many hives. And I used the oxalic acid in a vapor form, vaporizing it. It's very, all the research papers say that it's not very toxic at all to the bees. And it worked very well when I had just a couple hives in my backyard. Now I've expanded. I have 28 hives around Burlingame, and you know, with, like you mentioned, that the oxalic acid doesn't penetrate the wax, so you can treat the, basically all you're treating is the phoretic mites. So it requires, because of their life cycle, the mites, founder's mite goes into a cell, worker or drone. They prefer drones, like you said. The founders, once the cell is capped, starts laying eggs after 60 days. The first one's a male, then every 30, not 60 days, 60 hours. And then every 30 minutes, or 30, I can't get days and minutes correct right now. Anyway, every 30 days, another egg is laid, and these are females. And then, you know, because of difficulties the bees have, I mean, the mites have in the cell, mating, that sort of thing, they only produce one mite from workers, and they do 2.2 or so merging female mites with the original foundress. So when they leave, I mean, the capping on the drone is you know, so many days, 14 days actually. So if you treat, you've killed all the mites with oxalic acid, it's not, you know, a 90-something% kill rate for the mites, with very low kill rates for bees and brood. And if you do that every 5 days, then you will, after that 14-day period, will have exposed all of the mites that have emerged to the oxalic acid vapor. So that is a way that works for oxalic acid. Formic, on the other hand, does penetrate, but it's a continuous treatment. So oxalic is 1 shot, 2 shot, 3 shot, or 4 shot, spread out over numerous days. So the bees are not subjected to the oxalic continuously. The formic is in the hive on strips, and it stays in there. There's a 14-day treatment with 2 strips, and a 10-day followed by another 10-day treatment with 1 strip each. And those do very well. The problem with those is that they do cause damage to the developing brood. Eggs, young and older larvae have a certain mortality related to the formic acid. But the older bees tend to do better, and if, you know, your queen is very likely to survive, and then she can build up again. So it's probably not a good treatment, formic, in the late stages, after August, because there isn't enough time for the bees to build up their winter bees. It should be used before that time. Yeah, so that's what I use. I haven't used the chemical forms, the amitraz, the Agrivar, the other chemical treatments yet. So that's what I do.
Great, thanks, Bob. Oliver, are you available to turn your mic on?
Yes, I think it's on.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, we can hear you. Oliver, would you just speak briefly, 2 to 3 minutes, about how long you've been keeping bees? And I know you run the gamut in terms of treatments that you use, but what you're doing kind of now. What's the main way you treat now?
I've been keeping bees for 51 years, so I precede the mite attack by about 25 years. And when we first were hit by the mites in the mid 90s, the two available chemicals were Apistan, which is fluvinate, and Czech mite, which is Comophos. And the effect of the Apistan on the bees was shocking. It killed so many mites that the remaining bees could barely get out of their 3/8 inch entrance because the amount of mites in the hives those first few years, when you killed them with a miticide, they were a 1/4 inch deep pile all the way across the entrance. But it quickly became ineffective. It's still for sale, so I guess it works somewhere. And then I tried the Czech mite, which is Comophos, but it very quickly, people were saying, even the commercial beekeepers were saying, this is a organophosphate, I think it was, insecticide. It's really too toxic and it is absorbed by the wax too much, that we really shouldn't use it. It also is still available, but it, at that time in the 90s, got such bad publicity that we only used it once and then we quit using it. And then I pretty much went treatment free for a few decades, with tremendous losses the whole time, fluctuating up and down. And then at some point in the mid 2000s, I started getting clients to the beekeeping fad and interest started in 2006 with when CCD came to town, colony collapse disorder. And that year, about 60 to 80% of all commercial beehives were wiped out. And it made the media, huge media attention on beekeeping. And that's gone on till now. And that's when lots of hobbyists, after 5 years, they said there was already 12 million new beekeepers. And so now we're, 20 years later, 25 years later again. So there must be, 25 or 50 million new beekeepers. So CCD coming to town in 2006 is what started the great interest in bees. And so I have 13 clients now, or 12 or 14 or something, for whom I've built apiaries and keep bees. And so when you're doing something commercially, you don't want your product to die every year and have to sell your client new bees every year and not produce a crop for them because the hives have died. So I have for many years now, I tried Oxalic drip. It didn't work. From what Bob has taught me, Oxalic has to be applied about 4 times, once a week over a month. Well, I maintain about 150 hives across 30 apiaries. There's no way I could fit in going to each hive once a week for 4 weeks. I would have to devote a month or two, once or twice a year, to treating my bees with oxalic acid. So I don't like to use pesticides, but I started using Apivar, and it's very time effective. We apply it when we harvest in July, August, September. We put in the Apivar strip, and after 6 weeks, so that's only one trip, one application, and we're there already harvesting. So then 6 weeks later, we go back and remove it. And it helped reduce the winter losses substantially. But in the last few years, and I don't think any treatment reduces losses altogether. You're still going to have a substantial percentage of losses, irregardless of which treatment you're using. And I've lost my train of thought. So it prevented the winter losses pretty much, but in the last few years, we've had summer losses. And the summer losses, I don't know what causes it, but it seems that the hives do not end up with a new queen after swarming. Maybe they swarm too many times or something goes wrong and we end up with queenless hives after the swarming season. And so that's what I'm currently using is Apivar once a year in every hive. And there should probably be a spring treatment, but I have found that once the bees have made it to January, February, they are populating so heavily that they can most of them can overcome any mite infestation they have. And I have dozens of hives that go on to make a big crop, but I also have hives that kind of founder and don't do too much and even fade away over the summer. And that's maybe due to too high a mite population because they were only treated in fall.
Thanks, Oliver. Out of the three of you, I'm guessing Oliver and Bob, based on the number of hives that you keep, you don't test for mite load on a regular basis. Alla, are you testing for mite load, or do you just kind of like do your tea and your other practices regardless, so you don't test?
I'm testing my own way when I put the drone frames for bees to draw drone size comb, and bees put queen put drones in. So when they kept it at the beginning, I have to go in a hive every 14 days and cut out these drones. But before I cut it, with fork, I pull out like 20, 30 drones, and I check how many mites I have in a cell. So if I have two, 3 mites, I'm not worried, and I can even leave some drones in. If I have 5 and 8, then I aggressively put the frames, empty frames in, and cut out all drones. And these hives which have a lot of mites, it's a candidate for split. It's a first split, and then I isolate the queen. So I let the hive which I split with queen, I let go broodless as well. So one part of the split going to raise the queen, and it's gonna be broodless almost for a month. And second part, I let queen lay a lot of eggs. And after I isolate her in a special cage in a hive, I put her in a big cage so she can walk in, but she cannot lay. And bees not pulling queen cells. So it's kind of like they bring much more honey, like not double, like triple, 4 times, because all bees concentrated on honey production. So, and at the end of the month, I have 2 hives with basically not zero, it would never have zero, but very small amount of mites. And I do this periodically with every hive, like some hives does not boom in a spring very quick. It takes a month, sometimes even more, to grow to full brood box. But basically May, June, it's all dedicated to splitting and isolating queen.
Great. So the reason that I asked the question about testing for mite load is because it's something that we as the guild kind of recommend that beginners do. And I remember last year when we were talking about this, it became clear that none of our panelists actually did it. And I've done some reflecting on it over the last year, not the whole time.
Yeah, I can explain if you would like.
Oh yeah, well let me give you my kind of theory
okay.
first. But generally, as you're starting to learn to cook, as an analogy, you want to test your food before you salt it. The more you cook, the more you can actually salt food or especially recipes that you make frequently, without having to taste it as much. So I think that's kind of a good analogy for the panelists that you're speaking to today are very familiar with the cycle of Varroa, other secondary characteristics to look for to determine when there's a high mite load. So they don't need to do sugar rolls or alcohol washes as frequently or at all to determine the mite load, and they have kind of created a pattern for how they deal with mites. So what I mean the reason I bring this up is because I don't think beginners should take this as a sign, oh well, I don't need to test for mites. I think it's a good idea to test for mites, especially when you're starting out, so that you get an idea for whether or not your hive has a high mite load, and then whether or not your treatment works. And then over time, as you become a more experienced beekeeper, you may do it less. Alla, what were you going to add?
You're absolutely right, Alex, because at the beginning, my beekeeping, I was doing the test for 2 or 3 years. And finally, I figure out with this drone comb and fork, pull out drones. And I realized that it's almost the same amount, when I pull out my drones and it shows 2, 5 mites or 8 and 10 mites. So, and when I even 1 year I did just compare, like alcohol wash, and it was exactly right, like my 1 mite was different. So I think it comes with experience, and you're right, beekeepers should do everything, should go to the hive every week, should experience all kind of failures and and tests. So it's only for their benefits, because whatever we talking and whatever we explaining, it still would not come to their head unless they try it.
Great. Okay, we're going to open the floor to questions now. When you ask a question, please unmute. State who you would like to answer the question, whether or not it's Oliver, Alla, or Bob, and then ask your question. And I'll kind of fill things in if people are having a hard time warming up to asking questions. So, but we'll give it a moment for people to kind of gather their thoughts.
So I just want to say that there are various ways of testing for mite levels, and you don't have to test, you don't have to treat with low mite levels. There's an economic threshold. And if you're above the economic threshold of the numbers of mites per 100 bees, then there's a high likelihood your colony is not going to make it through the winter. The different methods that are recognized as being useful or more accurate, let's say, are the sugar roll, as long as it's done the same way every time by the person who's doing it. The alcohol wash, also very accurate. And it turns out that uncapping brood is one of the most accurate. But in order to do that, there's a protocol where you have to cut out 200 capped cells from a brood frame, and then open each cell and count the mites, the number of mite cells, the number of cells with the mites, and then count the number of open cells. And then you can divide the number of cells with mites by the total examined cells and multiply by 100. So that formula is more accurate than alcohol wash or sugar shake. But if you have 15 mites in 208 cells, you have a 7% infestation rate. So I'm sorry to say that just doing a couple, I guess you get experience when you've done this for a while, but it's the more bees you test, or the more cells you uncap, the more accurate you can become. And that economic threshold is what's been determined to be useful. And if you go above it, you're likely to lose your colony. And if you are below it, you're not likely to lose your colony.
Sally, you had a question?
Yes, on the Formic Pro, I don't remember who used that. Was that you, Bob? Is there is the longer period of time with one strip at a time, twice, easier on the bees than the 2 strips all at once?
Well, I would think so. You're putting in half the formic acid. Although it's over a longer period of time, you aren't hitting the hive for as high a dose at one time. So if I have hives that are burgeoning full, you're not supposed to use Formic Pro if you have less than 6 frames of bees in your brood chamber. So if I have I just examined a hive yesterday, I've got 10 deeps and 10 medium frames that are covered. So I would not worry at all about treating that with 2 strips. But if I just have only a deep box and a medium box and no honey supers, I'm more likely to put 1 strip in followed by another strip. Now, the company says that the 14-day treatment is much more effective at killing the mites, and the 10 plus 10 is a knockdown treatment in their terms. So yeah, it's the one strip is a lower dose of the formic acid.
Okay, good.
Does that answer your question?
I think so, yes, because I've only got the 1 hive right now, so that would, it just sounds better to me, a better choice.
Yeah, and I would say the best choice if you're using organic acids with 1 hive would be oxalic vapor. I just listened to a researcher from Oregon State University. As you know, you may or may not know, but oxalic acid vapor is illegal in California right now, even though it's legal in every other state in the country. But it is illegal. So,
I didn't know that, yeah, but I'm
yeah,
scofflaw.
but I used oxalic acid well before I used Formic Pro. For me, the difference was the number of times that you had to go in the hives as my apiaries grew. But like I was saying, I just was in a Zoom webinar with a university or Oregon State University researcher, and he showed slides of what they did was they took 7 hives and they put Mylar film over each hive and counted every single open brood in the hive. And then they treated with oxalic, and they treated with Formic Pro, and they treated with nothing as the control. And it turns out you kill a lot of eggs, and you kill a lot of young larvae, and you kill a lot of older larvae when you use Formic Pro. Whereas oxalic acid vapor is nearly identical to the control group. So you're not killing all the bees using oxalic acid. And I really can't wait until it's legal because I'd like to get back to using it, but I need to find a better way of applying it that doesn't, doesn't take 25 times 4, 100 visits to the hives over a month, or over 2 weeks. So
Does that affects the honey though, right? You can't use the
nope.
No?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope. Oxalic acid naturally occurs in honey. You have these little yellow flowers called oxalic. They have oxalic. Oxalic acid is all over the place in plants.
Oxalics, yeah. I used to eat that.
And oxalic has been tested before and after treatment with oxalic vapor in the honey, and there's no difference.
Two
before
quick
and
safety
after.
notes on Oxalic. One, if you do use vapor, please make sure to have the right protective equipment, including a mask. Breathing in the vapor can kill you. And the other, formic is also pretty nasty if you breathe it in. So, you know,
Absolutely.
I
think last year I went and grabbed my mask, and then Alla asked me if I got masks for all my bees too.
That's right. I remember that.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, as Bob said, like a lot of people do treat with Superzon or extract honey that has been treated with oxalic acid. I think the Honeybee Health Coalition, the only one they will have listed there is the drip, because that dripping with oxalic acid is the only thing that's legal in California. And doing the drip, they say you should only do when the honey supers are off, and that's based upon the approvals in the United States for the use of oxalic acid. Bob, I haven't done any research whether or not, like in Europe, if they can treat with oxalic vapor with supers on, but you have different regulating bodies doing different tests at different times. So if you're keeping the honey for yourself, then you know you can kind of do your own research. I'm going to say if you're selling your honey, you may want to be a little bit more cautious about what you do. Just, you know, food for thought.
I don't think oxalic is barred to be used with honey supers on.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't looked at the Honeybee Health Coalition recommendations or any other country's recommendations recently. So do your own research.
Oh, actually, I'm looking at the. Can you see that? It's
yeah.
A list of all of the, and it says that you're not supposed to have your supers on with oxalic acid.
Yeah, that's what I remembered too. However, I do know people who treat with oxalic and then keep the honey. So
Well,
yeah.
Where do you get it if it's illegal in California? Will they ship it in? Can you order it?
Oh, you go to the hardware store and just get wood bleach, pure oxalic acid. You don't have to buy it from a fancy store for a lot of money. It's cheap and readily available.
Thanks.
And then the battery and the thing that vaporizes it, you can get on websites on the internet. Cool. Anybody have a question for Oliver or for Alla? Peter, do you have a question or are you just clearing your throat?
I do have a question. I was clearing my throat, trying to get ready to ask it. You're psychic. Alla, you talk about your queen, you cage your queen and let her run around. What kind of how are you doing that? What do you do to make that happen?
So I found the website on European beekeeping from Ukraine, and there is a lot of beekeepers who keep double, triple, 4 queens in a hive, and to introduce them to each other, they keep them in a big cage, which kind of like a size of the frame, but it's made from the queen excluder, so queen can run all over inside, but space inside is very narrow, so bee cannot draw the comb inside. They can go in, clean the queen, get a pheromone from her, you know, but can't draw comb inside this frame. So I can provide the photo of this cage so anybody can do it. It's very simple, but I come to the conclusion that it takes a lot of space, and queen does not need so much. So I made a smaller cage, which is approximately 2/3 of the wide of the. I do have pictures, but I don't know how to show it on a panel. It's in a computer, and it's like I would say 10 inches long, 2 inches tall, and wide as a comb. So you have to cut the frame with comb and with honey. You can't put it in an empty frame because bee would have abandoned and they would not build the comb on this frame. So frame should be completely built and there should be already honey in. And then I cut the small kind of like cuts for this frame exactly size and I squeeze it in and put it in the middle or maybe like third position from the side. And bees love it, you know, like, and I love it because I don't need to treat, I don't need to remove my supers, I need only add supers on. And boy, it's just amazing, like every 2 weeks I take super or 2, you know, away with honey when I do this isolation.
Alla, would you consider like sending those pictures to the Google group, or if you have if you've posted this in previous years, we can find the previous post.
No, I never posted it. Nobody asked me. Only beekeeper from San Francisco, they asked me, and I am going to do a class over there to show them how to do it. So I will post this advertisement on our site. So if people would like to come to San Francisco, welcome. I would not mind because I don't have any more in San Mateo Apiary and I can't invite people there. And yeah, now when kind of like everybody already, I hope, vaccinated, so I'm inviting more people. So I probably can invite like 10, 12 people. And so we can go through all this piece by piece. I can explain everything, you know, how it works. And I would not do it if it would not work. So I'm doing this for 8 years. I guess, you know, it can say, I know I'm far away from Oliver, but yeah, it's actually fun. I think, you know, well, people would need to try and they will realize how easy it is and how effective it is. So
thanks, Alla. Yeah, if you would post details about the class, I think several people would be interested.
Yeah.
Anybody have a question for Oliver in particular, so we can kind of even out the work? I can ask Oliver a question. Oliver, so you know, you mentioned that you've been keeping bees since the before times when you didn't have to deal with Varroa. And you mentioned as well that the mite loads were particularly crazy in the first couple of years. What were the loss rates like in the first years after Varroa made it to the West Coast? Were they more than 50%? Were they more than what we're seeing now, or were they about the same?
They were, let's see, I think we were first hit in 94 or 95. And by 97, I had 1 hive left. And it had mites and American foul brood.
Oh, wow.
And I rebuilt from that. So in 94 and 95 and 96, or probably 95 and 96, we would go harvest the honey. And in that era, pre-mite, a 200-pound crop was common. And if you look at my YouTube channel, I have it's called the 1981 Bee Experience. And it was a movie made by friends in our bee club of us removing honey in Hillsborough and in Half Moon Bay, and just following us around and loading honey at the honey extracting room. And in that era, you could put any bee in any box and make 100 or 200 or 300 pounds of honey. And in this movie, which I hadn't, you know, I only saw it after 25 years, it was shocking how big the crops are. And you can see it's walking through my apiary in Hillsborough, and it was like walking through downtown New York, giant skyscraper hives. So in those years of the mid 90s, we would go to harvest the crop, and the crop would be there, but the hives would be empty of bees. And I guess all of the bees were so mite affected that there was no robbing. And so 95, 96, 97, we were probably losing 30, 40% of our bees each year during the summer, but we were still getting our crop. And after 2 or 3 years of that, there was no hives left. And then we restarted from packaged bees from Oliveris. And so there's often talk around here about feral bees. So of course there were no European honeybees here until Harbison brought them to San Jose, I think in 1849. And then when the mites came, when we started in the 70s, the bees around here were supposedly related to German bees, and they were impossible to manage. You'd work them and they would boil out of the hive like boiling milk and pour down the sides and then up your pants legs, and they would sting you like it was, you know, you were watching a movie about Africanized bees. And so we went through a whole program of requeening all of our hives in the late 70s when I was, you know, met bee club people and we all got together. And so we requeened everything with bees we bought mostly from the South, from Kelly and people like that, Bee Weaver, R Weaver. And so we had gentilized the bees substantially in the late 70s and 80s prior to the mites coming. And then the mites pretty much wiped out 100% of even the wild bees in the trees. And so any bees now date back to commercial bees that were bought in the late 90s.
Got it. So it was kind of like a restart. It's interesting, you know, you talk about how much of a shock it was to the beekeepers at the time. And it wasn't until years later that colony collapse disorder, CCD, became headline, but it was really, it was affecting bees way before that. So, you know, it's kind of interesting to hear that. Also, I'd like to, you know, to say that Oliver is sometimes a bit harsh in his responses to the Google group, but he does have a lot of experience. So if you,
I think that's a rumor.
but he is very gentle when you get to know him. So you know, feel free to ask questions. Great. Does anybody have any more questions for any of our three experts?
Yes.
Jeff?
I have a
Yes.
question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Let's do Jeff and then Elizabeth.
Yeah. So you mentioned the concept of feral bees. And obviously feral bees have now not been treated and they've been making it through. And last year I had 9 colonies. I lost 8 of them. And the one I did make it through was a feral colony. And this spring it swarmed 4 times. I caught all 4 of them, and they're all doing extremely well. So, and the original colony is doing very well. So that was 5. And I caught a swarm 6, and I put out a bait hive 7. And those are all feral colonies. I did buy 1 package of bees, buckfast bees from the San Francisco Club. But my point is that it seems to me if you have feral colonies that are making it, you're a lot less likely to have to treat. I mean, obviously they have mites. There's no question they have mites. But can somebody talk a little bit more about, you know, nobody's mentioned what kind of queens they have here. You know, I don't know if anybody is trying to intentionally raise feral colonies, which I'm trying to, and I know other people who don't believe in treating. This year I might do some treating, but because I don't want to lose a lot of hives again. But, you know, anyway, the concept of feral colonies and not having to treat.
I have a question. May I ask you back? What's the difference between feral colony and colony you raise?
Well, no, the ones most of them, 7 out of the 8 I have are all feral colonies. The only one that's not a feral colony is the
No, what
buckfast.
is the difference? What is the difference? What do you think? Feral and bees you have in your hive.
Well, I have to say the buckfast, they build up super fast and give a huge amount of honey. I had a buckfast hive last year that just was a bomber thing, just incredible, but it did not make it through the winter, so does that answer your question? I'm sorry.
Did you treat it?
I did no treatment at all. No, I that's not true. I do powdered sugar. I'll treat them a couple of times in the fall with powdered sugar, and that's it.
Well, that's been shown not to work.
Yeah, so there you go.
I think we have to be careful talking about, we have to get the definition of feral. I think feral basically means something that hasn't been domesticated. And I think the reason when you say your feral bees are good, the reason for that is they've been locally mated. And the problem with all the package bees, including the package bees from the San Francisco Club, is they've been commercially mated. So if a queen here on the peninsula mates, she has access to the drones of hundreds and hundreds of hives spread over tens of thousands of acres. Whereas commercially mated queens, they're mating thousands and thousands of hives on 1 acre or 2 acres or 5 acres, all very congested together. And some of the queen breeders don't even supply drone colonies. So a lot of all the packages I've bought in the last 5 or 10 years that go bad seems to me to be they haven't been fertilized properly because there's not enough drones for them to mate with in commercial mating yards. And whereas here, if they're feral or if they're domestic or they're in an oak tree, regardless of where they are, they have an unlimited amount of drones to mate with. And so they get very, very well mated. So you said your buckfast package didn't make it. The reason that usually is the queen runs out of sperm because in the winter or often it's even in August because she hasn't been mated properly.
Right, interesting, very interesting.
So may I also add something to this? My 5 cents. So Oliver Wright, commercial beekeepers, they treat all their bees and queen and feed them and whatever they do, I don't know, but a lot of involvement, human involvement in a hive. When you keep your hive and you don't do much, you just monitor mites, and if they do have, how feral bee control mites amount, they swarm. They abandon the hive in the tree and they go somewhere else. So if you will split your hive and make your new hive from scratch again, fresh comb, not foundation, not contamination, nothing, you will have a big drones like an elephant, and they will mate with your queen. And not only yours, Oliver Wright, we have so many drones, but we're buying queens, we're buying nooks, we're buying packages from somebody who came from almond pollination, from who know where, and they treat and treat and treat. And if you will buy not treated bees, you will see the difference.
The other thing about that is the queens that are produced are not immediately put in a hive to start laying. They're banked. The commercial guys, I went and visited Oliveris one year, and they have a room that is filled with caged queens. Now, how long those queens sit there will affect their ability to start laying. And if they're sitting there for weeks, that's a problem for the
It's a
queen to
good for
start
weeks.
laying.
They sitting there for months. They forgot that they're queens already.
Well, yeah, for whatever time, if you know, Oliver and I have been raising a few queens, and those queens go immediately from their cell to their hive to get mated with drones in our area, and then they come back and they start laying within 5 days. And that's kind of what you want if you can get it, but it takes a lot of work to get that done.
Elizabeth, you had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to know, Oliver mentioned something to me a few days back that I thought was very interesting about his treatment protocol when he gets a brand new colony in, a swarm or a package, and I wonder if he could say something about that. And I would definitely add my 2 cents to the group that, yeah, if you're raising a queen, even if it's just from a simple walk-away split, you have a chance of making a much nicer queen even than you can buy, even without putting any particular effort in it. And I really recommend everybody try to raise their own queens. But I'd like to submit the question to Oliver.
I have for 3 years now, any swarm or package I buy, I immediately or as soon as possible, if you catch a swarm or a bait hive swarm, it has no brood for the mites to be hiding in. The only mites are the phoretic mites on the outside of the bees. And so when I catch a swarm or I install a package, I apivar it immediately, because that can immediately within a week or 2 or 3 or 4 weeks kill all the mites on the outside of the bees, and before there is any brood for the mites to enter and breed in. And I have found that those immediately apivarred swarms and packages thrive and build up much faster and stronger than ones that I do not apivar upon installation. And so I apivar them when I start them, which is April and May, March, April and May, and maybe even June. And then when we harvest the apiary they're in, sometimes we skip over those, because if we have apivarred them in the beginning of April, we've only removed that apivar in the middle of June. So there's really no reason to 6 weeks later in August, when we're harvesting that yard, to apivar them again. So some of them just get that initial treatment when they're new, but we skip the treatment when we treat the apiary that they're in. And that's been working well for me. I would like to devise a spring treatment, but it's hard to do with our flows, because often we have that damn eucalyptus flow in December and January and February, and it's hard to find a window to treat where you're not treating with honey supers on them.
I just want to add to what Oliver just said. And, you know, if you get a swarm in, if you get a package in, and there's no comb built out, nowhere for a capped brood to occur, a single treatment of oxalic acid vapor will kill more than 95% of the mites that came with that colony.
Cool.
And they do, and the mites do come with those colonies, with the packages and with the swarms.
Jeff, you're muted.
Yeah. So can somebody explain the oxalic acid vapor part of it? Somebody posted the, wood bleach, which is oxalic acid. I understand that, but how you actually use it? What's the vaporizer look like? Where do you get that?
You go to any bee supply, Man Lake, Dodont, I don't know how you say Dodont, but that's how I say it.
Right.
et cetera, they all have oxalic acid vaporizers. They're
Mhm.
basically a cup, a metal cup with a long stem that can be inserted into the bottom of the hive, and then electrical cables with clips that look like jumper cables, and those attach to a battery, and it heats up the cup. You put your oxalic acid in the cup before you put it in the hive. Once it's in there, you hook the battery up, and that cup heats up and vaporizes the oxalic acid into the hive.
Oh, okay.
And
Yeah.
Very
YouTube
cool.
is your friend here, you know, so.
Got it, right.
Yeah, true.
All right. Does anybody have a final question? We'll do one or two more maybe, and then we'll switch over and do the raffle and then call it a night.
Thanks, everybody, all three of you guys. That was great.
You're here.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you to Alla, Bob, and Oliver once again for volunteering. If we do this again next year, I'm going to insist that we give them a break and that some other people volunteer to be our panelists. But we really do appreciate you guys. Thank you for volunteering 2 years in a row to share your knowledge and experience with the members about.
It's an hour of our life we'll never get back.
It's true, Oliver.
You get your reward in heaven, Oliver.
I hope.
If he goes there.
Hey, I promoted your YouTube video, your 1981 YouTube video. It's in the comments.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. I know you're getting huge commissions on the advertising for that. So, all right. Thanks everybody. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording now.